Life Stories brings you another powerful tale of resilience, hidden talent, and unexpected triumph. Imagine being the quiet student in the back of the classroom, unnoticed, overlooked until one moment changes everything. Today, we follow Emma Carter, a seventh grader who spent years blending into the background, hiding a remarkable gift for mathematics. But when her strict teacher, Ms. Reynolds, attempts to humiliate her in front of the class, Emma is forced to step into the spotlight, revealing a brilliance no one saw coming. Get ready for an unforgettable journey of self-discovery. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's story. The soft hum of middle school chatter filled the air as students filed into room 207 at Lincoln Middle School in Chicago, Illinois. It was just another day in Ms. Reynolds' 7th grade math class, where students either struggled to stay awake or dreaded the next pop quiz. The atmosphere was thick with the typical teenage mix of boredom, unease, and quiet defiance. Near the back of the room, seated by the window, Emma Carter kept her head low, her fingers tapping lightly against the wooden desk. She had mastered the art of invisibility, a skill honed over years of careful avoidance, of dodging unwanted attention, of never quite fitting into the mold others expected. It wasn't that she disliked school, nor that she found math difficult. Quite the opposite. Numbers had always been her safe space, a world that made sense when the real one didn't. But it was easier this way. Staying quiet meant no one questioned her, no one judged, and no one expected anything beyond the ordinary. Emma's notebooks were her secret. While most of her classmates scribbled down hurried notes, hers were filled with equations far beyond what 7th graders were expected to understand. She had spent nights poring over college-level textbooks she found in the school library, challenging herself with problems meant for students much older than her. But she had never once revealed this to anyone. And yet, today was different. Ms. Reynolds stood at the front of the class, frustration etched deep into the lines of her face. She had spent weeks drilling basic algebra into these students. And yet, judging by the vacant expressions staring back at her, it might as well have been another language. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. This, she said, holding up a worksheet, is basic algebra. Basic. And yet, half of you still can't seem to figure it out. The room fell silent. No one dared to move. Ms. Reynolds wasn't a bad teacher. She was passionate, deeply invested in her students' education. But she was also strict, uncompromising. She had no patience for mediocrity, and even less for students who refused to put in the effort. Some admired her, others feared her, but all respected her. She paced across the room, her heels clicking against the tile, scanning the rows of slumped shoulders and averted gazes. You're going to see questions like these on every test from now until college, she continued, her voice sharp. If you don't understand them now, you're setting yourselves up for failure. Her eyes landed on Emma. Miss Carter. Emma's head snapped up. Her stomach twisted. She had been so careful, so intentional about blending in. But now, every pair of eyes in the room turned to her. You've been awfully quiet back there, Ms. Reynolds said, tilting her head slightly. Let's see if you've been paying attention. Emma swallowed, her hands gripping the edges of her desk. She gave a small nod, barely above a whisper. Yes. Ms. Reynolds turned to the board and, with swift, deliberate strokes, began writing an equation. It stretched across the board in an intricate dance of variables and exponents, something far beyond the level of a middle school math class. Gasps rippled through the room. Emma's throat tightened. This wasn't just a question meant to test her, it was meant to humiliate her. Solve it. She knew that was coming before Ms. Reynolds even turned back to face her. The classroom buzzed with hushed whispers. No way she can do that, someone muttered. What even is that? Another voice whispered. Emma could feel the weight of their expectations, or lack thereof, bearing down on her. She hesitated, not out of fear of the problem, but because she knew what would happen if she solved it. If she stood up now and answered correctly, she wouldn't be invisible anymore. And yet, something in her rebelled against the idea of just sitting there and letting them believe she couldn't. Ms. Reynolds crossed her arms. "Anytime now," she said, a trace of amusement in her voice. "Or do you need a calculator?" Laughter scattered through the room like falling dominoes. Emma's fingers tightened around her pencil. She knew this equation. She understood it in a way she couldn't quite explain, like it was part of her. Like solving it was second nature. Slowly, she stood. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound slicing through the hushed classroom. She walked to the front, her sneakers barely making a sound against the tile. She reached for the chalk. It was cold against her fingers. But she didn't hesitate. As she started writing, the whispers ceased. At first, it must have looked like random numbers and symbols to the other students. But as she continued, a pattern emerged. Each step was precise, deliberate. There was no fumbling, no hesitation, just the quiet certainty of someone who had done this 100 times before. The only sound was the soft scratch of chalk against the board. Ms. Reynolds, who had started this challenge with a smirk, now took a step forward, her arms unfolding, her expression unreadable. Emma didn't look at her. She was lost in the rhythm of numbers, of solutions unfolding effortlessly before her. She reached the final step, circled the answer, and set the chalk down. Then, she turned to face the class. Silence. For the first time since the lesson had begun. No one was laughing. No one was whispering. Every single pair of eyes was fixed on her, wide with disbelief. Ms. Reynolds stared at the board, her gaze moving over each line of Emma's work. She muttered under her breath as she checked each step. She couldn't find a single mistake. The silence stretched on, heavy, unbroken. Finally, Ms. Reynolds turned to Emma, her voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it before. "How?" she asked. Emma shifted on her feet. Her heart pounded. But she forced herself to answer. "I've been studying," she said simply. "It made sense once I broke it down." Ms. Reynolds blinked, then let out a slow breath. She had prided herself on recognizing potential in her students. And yet, she had completely missed this. She had underestimated Emma Carter, the quiet girl at the back of the room who had just done the impossible. Emma looked around. For once, people weren't ignoring her. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. The silence in the room felt different now, not the awkward quiet that followed Ms. Reynolds' sharp criticisms, nor the forced hush of students waiting for the bell to ring. This was something heavier, something charged. It was the kind of silence that followed a moment so unexpected, so out of place, that no one quite knew how to react. Emma could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their stares pressed against her skin, making her wish she could shrink back into herself, disappear into the background the way she had always done before. But it was too late for that now. The equation on the board stood as undeniable proof of something she had never intended to reveal. Ms. Reynolds was still standing by the board, her gaze flickering between the problem and Emma, as if she needed more time to process what had just happened. Her hand lifted slightly, as though she might reach out to point out a mistake, except there wasn't one. Emma knew it. And now Ms. Reynolds did too. The teacher cleared her throat, her usual sharp tone replaced by something softer, something almost hesitant. "This," she began, but then stopped. She shook her head slightly and turned back to the class. "This is how you solve a problem." A murmur rippled through the room. Some students exchanged bewildered glances. Others just sat frozen in their seats. No one had expected this, not from Emma Carter. The girl who barely spoke, who never raised her hand, who seemed more comfortable fading into the background than standing at the front of the room with chalk dust on her fingers. Then, something unexpected happened. A single clap. Emma flinched at the sound, her head snapping toward the back of the room. It was James Reynolds, a boy who was usually too busy doodling in the margins of his notebook to care about what happened in class. He grinned, shaking his head in disbelief, and clapped again. A second later, Sophie Wallace, one of the louder students, joined in. Then another. And another. Before Emma could fully grasp what was happening, the entire class was clapping. Her face burned. She had never been the center of attention before, at least. Not in a way that didn't involve getting teased or overlooked. This was different. It wasn't laughter at her expense. It wasn't whispers behind cupped hands. It was recognition. She wasn't sure what to do with that. Ms. Reynolds lifted a hand, and the applause slowly faded. She turned back to Emma, her expression unreadable. "Why didn't you ever speak up before?" she asked. Emma hesitated. She had never been good at explaining herself. How could she put into words what it felt like to not want to stand out? To want to be good at something, but not in a way that made people look at you differently? "I didn't think anyone would care," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Reynolds blinked. A flicker of something passed through her expression. Was it regret? Guilt? Whatever it was. It softened the sharp edges of her usual demeanor. "Well," she said after a moment, "you were wrong about that." The words hung in the air, and Emma felt something shift inside her. She didn't know if it was a good thing or a terrifying thing. Maybe both. Ms. Reynolds turned back to the class. "All right. Let's take a moment to appreciate what we just witnessed," she said. Her voice firm but not unkind. Emma not only solved this problem, she did it in a way that demonstrates a level of understanding far beyond what's expected at this level. Emma swallowed hard, resisting the urge to retreat to her seat. She had already taken a step forward, and there was no undoing it now. Ms. Reynolds turned to her once more. "Go ahead and take your seat, Emma." Emma nodded quickly, practically rushing back to her desk. The whispers started up again as soon as she sat down. Students sneaking glances at her, still trying to make sense of what had happened. She clutched her notebook tightly, willing herself to disappear again. But she knew deep down that wasn't going to happen. For better or worse, everything had changed. Emma sat at her desk, gripping the edges of her notebook as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The classroom had returned to normal, at least. As normal as it could be after what had just happened. Ms. Reynolds resumed her lesson. But the energy in the room had shifted. The air buzzed with an unspoken understanding. Something significant had happened. And no one quite knew what to make of it yet. Emma wasn't used to attention. And she certainly wasn't used to admiration. But now, glances flickered in her direction. Whispers passed from desk to desk, and the occasional nod of approval came from students who had never once spoken to her before. It was unsettling. She kept her gaze fixed on the numbers in her notebook, trying to retreat into the familiar world of equations and logic. But the sense of invisibility that had always protected her was slipping away, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to catch it or let it go. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. As students packed their things, Ms. Reynolds' voice cut through the noise. "Emma, can you stay for a moment?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Students exchanged knowing glances as they filed out, some sneaking one last look at Emma before disappearing into the hallway. Emma's stomach twisted. Had she done something wrong? She remained seated as the last student left, her hands tightening around the straps of her backpack. The classroom was suddenly too quiet, the absence of chatter making the moment feel heavier. Ms. Reynolds leaned against her desk, arms crossed, her usual stern expression softened by something Emma couldn't quite place. "I owe you an apology," she said. Emma blinked. Of all the things she had expected, that wasn't one of them. "An apology," she echoed, unsure if she had heard correctly. Ms. Reynolds nodded. "I underestimated you. I assumed you were just coasting through class like everyone else. But I was wrong. You're extraordinary, Emma. And I should have seen that sooner." Emma sat frozen, unsure of how to respond. No teacher had ever spoken to her like this, not as just another student, but as a person. as someone whose talents had value. Ms. Reynolds sighed, shaking her head slightly. I see students come and go every year. Some struggle. Some excel. And some hide. She gave Emma a pointed look. You've been hiding, haven't you? Emma lowered her gaze. Yes. She had spent so much time making sure no one noticed her, afraid of what might happen if they did. Ms. Reynolds' voice softened. Emma, you have a gift. And it's not just about solving equations, it's about the way you think. The way you break things down. That's rare. Emma swallowed, a lump forming in her throat. She had never thought of herself that way before. There are programs, competitions, scholarships. Ms. Reynolds continued. Opportunities that could really challenge you. I think you'd be incredible. Emma's heart raced. The thought of stepping into something bigger, of embracing the part of herself she had always kept hidden, was terrifying. But it was also thrilling. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. I'll think about it. Ms. Reynolds smiled. That's all I ask. As Emma stood and walked toward the door, she realized something had shifted inside her. For the first time, she wasn't just someone trying to disappear. She was someone worth noticing. As Emma walked out of the classroom, her mind swirled with emotions: fear, excitement, uncertainty. She had spent so long trying to stay invisible. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she was meant for something more. The whispers in the hallway, the admiring glances from her classmates, even Ms. Reynolds' words, all of it felt surreal. That night, she opened her notebook. But instead of solving equations in secret, she began writing down goals. Maybe she would enter a competition. Maybe she would push herself beyond the comfort of her quiet world. For so long, she had believed no one cared. But now, she knew the truth. She mattered. Her story is a reminder that hidden talent is everywhere, waiting to be discovered. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment of courage to change everything. Subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring videos.